Hello everybody, and welcome to this presentation about why patients should consider getting involved in research studies. My name is Dr. Amanda Stranks and I'm the Patient and Public Involvement Lead at NIHR Cambridge Biomedical Research Centre, and I work closely with my PPI colleagues across the campus. It's always a good idea to start with a bit of a description about what we mean by involvement in clinical research. And the body called INVOLVE, or the formerly known as INVOLVE, defines patient and public involvement in research as research being carried out with or by members of the public rather than to, about, or for them. And I like to think of patient and public involvement as being about listening to our patients and working directly with them side by side to make sure that the research that we do reflects their needs and priorities. And ultimately, it's about influence. If all we do is listen, but we don't take any action, then we haven't really changed anything. So we always want to see the influence and patience of patients and public coming through the research to make it even stronger. I'm often asked whether or not involvement is similar to taking part in a trial, but they're quite different activities. People who participate in clinical trials help researchers to answer their research question by providing information. So we call this data. Information to help them answer their research question. They let us study them or their health condition so that we understand more. So this might be by things like providing blood samples, testing a new medicine or treatment, or sharing their data with researchers. Involvement is a different way that members of the public can interact with research, and you might have come across these other activities. So we talk about involvement in research, engagement with research, and participation. And ideally, all three of these activities work together to make our research more accountable and more patient-focused. If you live in and around Cambridge, you may well have come across engagement activities in the past, because this is things like Fun Lab, or what used to be known as the Cambridge Science Festival and now is just the Cambridge Festival, and things like the Cambridge Festival of Ideas. And what happens at engagement events is researchers tend to share their results. They might tell you a little bit about their research projects overall. And the overall aim is to increase transparency so that the public understand what we're doing and have a bit of a chance to have a say at a kind of a wider level. Participation, on the other hand, as I just mentioned, is when people take part in a study. They let researchers study them or something about them so that we understand more about health and disease. So if in engagement we're asking for your attention, and in participation we're asking for your data to help us learn more about things, what are we asking for in involvement? Well, involvement is all about sharing your thoughts and ideas. We want you to tell us what is a good thing to research and how we can make our research even better. In public involvement, we are asking you to lend your voice and your expertise because your knowledge complements ours. As the saying goes, two heads are better than one, and your experience can go hand in hand with the types of experience that we have as research and medical professionals. Medical professionals and scientists have what we call learned experience that we gain through our degrees or through our clinical practice that gives us knowledge about the causes of disease and treatments in a healthcare setting. But members of the public have what's known as lived experience, knowledge about living with the condition as part of their wider daily life. People getting involved in research helps researchers to ask their questions in a better way. So those involved in research help researchers to ask the right people, the right research questions, and to do it in the right way that we get the best answers. They also help researchers to identify the right way to measure what we're looking at and to measure the right outcomes to find the right solutions for patients. Once we've finished with research, those that are involved can also help researchers to share the results in the right way to make sure that they reach the right people who can use that information, be they doctors or be they people with that particular health condition. So why else should we do patient involvement? Well, again, using those two forms of expertise together adds a real value to the research that we do and makes sure that it is right for everyone. There's also a really strong argument, what we call the democratic right, the idea that those who are paying for research, either via taxation or donation, and particularly those who are going to be affected by its use, should have a right to influence its development and use. We also have some good evidence to suggest that members of the public can improve the research that we do, both the way that we do it by making clinical trials easier to take part in, but also to make sure that the things that we're making are actually useful. And this means that there is what we call reduced waste in research. So we're not wasting our time in studies that people aren't going to participate in and that aren't going to make things that are actually helpful. There's also a really strong policy imperative. Now that we know that there are lots of good reasons for doing patient and public involvement and very few reasons for not doing it, most medical funders these days require researchers to have evidence of good quality public involvement before they're allowed to fund particular research projects. And this is not to say that doctors and researchers don't want what's best for patients. Doctors and researchers choose the things that they research based on lots of different things. It tends to be things like what they're interested in, where their experience lies, what other professionals say, where their training is, what they can get money for. There's a certain amount of inertia based behind it. But I've never ever met a doctor or a scientist who doesn't want to do something that will benefit patients. But the whole point of involvement is that there's no way to know what the needs and what would benefit patients unless we actually ask them. And patient priorities and family priorities, indeed, can often be quite different than what researchers think might be the priorities. So if we look at researcher priorities, they tend to be very focused on a cure and extending life and managing symptoms. But if we ask patients what they want, as well as those things, they often ask for other things that researchers might not think of. This might be outcomes that are completely different. So many patients might not care whether or not their blood pressure goes up and down unless they're actually feeling better, for example. They also want research to treat or improve symptoms as well as just changing the course of disease. The question, can we live well with this condition, comes up time and time again. It's also a real request for pragmatic options, not things that only work in a clinical trial or as a gold standard, but for treatment options that work in the real world, their real world. And also that consider the mental health burden that's associated with their condition, treating mind and body at the same time. The final thing that comes up time and time again, and that patients can really help researchers with, is a request to make sure that all research is presented and decided in language that matches that of the affected population. And I don't just mean different languages that we speak in different countries, but the very words that we use, making sure there's not too much jargon, that it's the same way that people describe themselves. And I keep talking about patient and public involvement, but it's patients and more. You do not need to be a patient, either past or in the present, to be involved in research. We have people who are partners, who have all sorts of perspectives that are useful for research, carers of people with a particular condition, parents, friends, healthcare professionals, particularly outside of the sphere of the researcher. Patient advocates have a lot that they can contribute to research. Community workers have all sorts of expertise that we can build upon. And members of the public themselves also have different perspectives. The goal in patient and public involvement is to have input from the widest range of perspectives as possible. So what's in it for patients to get involved? When I spoke with the patient and public involvement panel that I work with about why they get involved, these are the kinds of things that they told me were important to them. They described a real opportunity to affect change. A lot of people come to patient and public involvement either because they've had perhaps an unpleasant experience with research, or perhaps it was a really good one, but they want to be able to contribute to positive change in the research and treatment sphere. Some people really just want to learn more about a condition or about research in general. Some people really enjoy the opportunity to meet people with similar experiences, or perhaps people who have a similar condition but have had a very different experience to broaden their horizons. There is an opportunity to learn new skills and also to develop confidence and agency, the ability to argue and advocate for oneself and for other people. One of the most common things that comes up, though, is the chance to give something back to the NHS. People feel that this is their way to contribute to the wider notion of the NHS to improve things for other people. Finally, there's a sense of satisfaction from making a positive difference. So what might you be asked to do if you get involved in research? Well, ultimately, the ways and the activities that are often part of patient and public involvement, there's nothing really very fancy about them at all. They're all just techniques and activities that encourage thinking, listening, and the sharing of opinions. So they're all activities that you probably recognise. It might be things like a lot of chatting back and forth by email or via text. You might sit down and just have a chat with a researcher, or maybe it will take the form of a slightly more formal interview to discuss what you think about their research. You might be invited to join a discussion group, sometimes also called a focus group, which is where you meet with a group of other patients and a researcher to discuss a single project for, tends to be about 1 or 2 hours at a time. You might be invited to sit on a meeting or an oversight committee to help oversee research as it goes along. You might be invited to take a survey or a questionnaire, or again, just chat directly with researchers by phone. They might ask you to join in a workshop, which tends to be a half-day experience, a bit of a longer period of time, speaking to lots of different professionals about their research. You also might have the opportunity to review documents. Research comes with a lot of paperwork, and one of the easiest ways for people to get involved is by contributing to some of these documents. There's lots of different PPI roles available as well. You might start out just doing a little bit of PPI, or you might be really, really interested and go all the way through to some of the more advanced types of positions. So the types of things I'm thinking about, again, might be answering a questionnaire, sitting on a lay panel, so joining a group of other people who are interested in research and providing your feedback over a period of time. You might join a focus group, chat directly to a researcher, and then as you get more and more experienced and involved, you might even act as an advisor for a study or join a steering or oversight committee. Some PPI members go on to undertake what's called a PPI lead role. So in a research project, you would be the person that is in charge of deciding how other people should be involved in the research. Or you might even be invited to be a co-applicant in a study, which means that you are one of the research team tasked with delivering this research and finding an answer to that scientific question. There are even some patients and members of the public who go on to suggest and lead a study directly themselves, not just part of the research team, but leading that team. And the point of showing all these roles is really just to highlight that there's a different way of doing PPI for everyone, and you're able to choose the type of involvement style that's right for you. So what might you be asked? Well, this is sort of one of those tricky questions because the answer is a bit like, how long is a piece of string? Of course, it depends a bit on the research study at hand. But the types of questions that you might be asked to consider are things like what kinds of things you think that we should study, particularly if you have a health condition of interest. What outcomes are important to you? What should the researchers measure to determine whether or not this project or this new treatment has worked? We might ask you how you feel about an idea or a particular study. And given that researchers are not always very good at explaining themselves, we might also ask you what you understand about a particular study, what questions you have. A good way of determining whether or not people think it's a good study is to ask people whether or not they'd participate themselves, hypothetically, if they were offered, or perhaps whether or not they'd recommend it to a family member. And this is a good way of helping researchers to understand where concerns lie. We might also ask you where you go looking for information. Once a researcher has finished this study, for example, where can they publish the results so that people will actually be able to find them and read them? We might also ask things like, where might we advertise this study? Where do people with a particular condition go? What news stories, etc. do they read so that we can publicise the study correctly to find the right people? And again, there's no magic here. The overall idea of all these questions is just to generate discussion and sharing ideas to make sure that the research team can find common priorities, meaning, language, and then develop a plan of action to do the research in the best way for everyone. And what kinds of things might I be invited to look at? Well, again, there is a lot of paperwork that goes with research, and often a lot of what we use to provide information to other people comes in the form of paper, either in the physical sense or in a digital format. So there's lots of things that you can help us write, create, and improve. And that includes things like research proposals. And these are applications for funding, and it tends to describe the whole project itself, and you can give us feedback that way. We might ask you to have a look at things like patient information leaflets, which are information that is given to patients who are thinking of taking part in a trial. So it has to have all of the information that they'd need to make that decision in an accessible format. We might also show you things like recruitment posters. Would you take part if you'd seen this particular study? consent forms, lay summaries, which are short summaries of research that are presented in plain English. Again, researchers are not always very good at creating these, and members of the public can be extremely helpful to do this. So how can you go about getting involved? Well, if I've managed to convince you that involvement might be right for you, there's 3 questions that I would encourage you to think about before you get involved. The first is, what kind of research are you interested in? Are you interested in research in general, so you'd be open to being involved in any kind of research? Or are you particularly interested in a specific type of health condition, for example, heart disease or cancer? The second question is, what kind of involvement are you looking for? Do you think you'd like to do something in a group or on a meeting, or would you be quite happy and comfortable being on a steering committee or doing some of the more involved work? And the third question is kind of related to the second. How much time do you want to commit? Do you just want to do maybe an hour or 2 a week or a month or even a year? Or are you happy to devote quite a bit of time to this and again, join a full-time research team? Once you know that, if your interests lie into research in a particular condition, then there are several places that you can look for involvement activities. A good place to start is by asking your clinician, particularly if you are treated in a large treatment hospital like CUH or like Royal Papworth. You can ask your clinician if they're undertaking any research or if they know any clinicians who are, and whether or not there are any involvement activities there. Patient support groups and also medical charities also often have involvement groups that you might be able to join. So medical charities such as Cancer Research UK, Parkinson's UK, Stroke UK, the British Heart Foundation all have established PPI groups that you might consider joining. If you have an idea of a research project yourself, you can get in touch with an organisation known as the Patient-Led Research Hub, or you can suggest research topics to major funding bodies such as the National Institute for Health Research. There's also a website called People in Research, and this website acts as a bit of a matchmaking website for researchers and members of the public. So researchers can go onto this website, advertise their opportunities to get involved, and likewise members of the public can go on and search for projects that are near them or that they're interested in. So what questions should you ask before getting involved in PPI? So if you do get invited to be involved in a research project by a researcher, the types of questions that I'd encourage you to think about are, how much time do they want you for? Are they thinking 1 hour a week, 1 hour a month, several hours a week? So ask them how much time they think will be involved, and also how long the research will go for overall. One of the studies that I'm being involved in at the moment has a 7-year life cycle. So do check how long the research goes for. Also ask whether or not you'll need to go somewhere. Now, of course, this seems a little bit silly at the moment in the midst of a pandemic, but once the pandemic is finished, will they expect you to travel to come to meetings in person, or will you be able to join digitally? Will there be any payments for your expenses, particularly if you do need to travel? And is there any honoraria or payments for your time? It can also be really useful to ask the researchers, what has happened so far? How did they get to this point in their research cycle? And also what the next steps are. For all of the busyness of research, there does tend to be a lot of waiting around as researchers get the various approvals that they need, or wait for funding, or wait for the trial to start. So do ask them where they're up to and what's going to happen next. It's also really useful to have the name and contact details of at least one person in the research team that you can get in contact with if you have any questions. And that might be about directions, or when the next meeting is, or perhaps to help you understand something that's written in a text. But having someone that you can get in contact with is an important part of good PPI. It can also be useful to know who else is on the research team. Some research teams are very big. They might have 5, 10, even 15 people on them. Some of them are very small, just perhaps a PhD student and a principal investigator. But it's always nice to feel part of the team, and to do that you need to know who else is on the team with you. It's also very important that you know what happens if you want to or need to stop. Particularly in long research projects, It might be that your circumstances change, maybe you move to a different area, or you change jobs, or maybe your health changes a little bit, or that of your family members does. So if you need to change or stop your PPI, it's useful to know how that process goes about. Finally, you'll want to know how the researchers can tell you about the difference that you're making. If you're going to spend your valuable time and your expertise making suggestions about a research project, it's nice to know whether or not researchers are taking those on board. So do ask your researcher how they will give you feedback about how your contributions have been used. All of this information should be discussed and agreed, so do ask these questions. And you can also ask for what's called a role description, which is a bit like a job description, which is just a way of recording these decisions and expectations. And that way you'll have a copy and your research team will have a copy, and you'll always have something to refer to. Where else can you go for information? Well, a good place to start is your local PPI team. And most hospitals and universities have one of these. So I'm part of the PPI team at Cambridge University Hospitals and for the Cambridge Biomedical Research Centre. Leanne and Chrissy lead the PPI team at the Royal Papworth, and all across campus, different organisations have their own PPI teams. And I covered earlier about what you should do if you are looking for a PPI activity in a specific area. If you're more generally interested in research, then we are good people to come to. I know that Chrissy and Leanne run the Patient Research Ambassador opportunities for people to get involved. So if you're interested in Papworth research, that might be an opportunity for you. At my own hospital, we have the Cambridge University Hospitals Patient and Public Involvement Panel, which is open for any person in and around Cambridge who is interested in research to join. You don't need to have any kind of experience, and you can do as much or as little as you wish. So we have some people on the panel who really only contribute to one project a year, and that's fantastic. And then we have some people who respond to almost every opportunity that we have. And we really like that we can offer a range of opportunities. If you're from a little bit further afield, another place to look for information is on the NIHR involvement websites and the various different NIHR websites that are out there local to you. There's also a website called the Health Talk website. And what I like about this website is it's got lots of videos from people who have been involved in research, which are good explainers. And again, the final place is those websites and information from your charities of interest. So again, organisations such as the British Heart Foundation have their own involvement website and information about involvement that might be right for you. So thank you all very much for listening to this presentation, and thank you very much to the members of the Cambridge University Hospitals PPI panel, because they helped me come up with all of the information that is in these slides, and also to my home PPI communications team who keep me organised and help me put this together as well. So thank you very much for listening, and please get in touch if you have any questions.